A ranger found a dwelling inside a giant oak. The one who lived there changed the way he saw everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The sector lay far from the visitor centers and paved roads, folded into a stretch of land that maps reduced to a pale green shape bordered by rivers and stone ridges. On paper, it looked simple enough, a manageable area assigned to one ranger at a time, marked by natural boundaries that made it easy to define and difficult to reach. In reality, it was a place that resisted convenience. The rivers cut deep and cold, swelling unpredictably after storms. The ridges were old, broken spines of rock that forced long detours and punished anyone who tried to cross them too quickly. Between them stretched a forest that had grown dense and quiet over generations, interrupted by marshy lowlands, scattered clearings, and narrow corridors where the wind seemed to move differently, carrying sounds farther than expected and swallowing them just as suddenly. Officially, the sector was a success story. It appeared in reports as an example of balance achieved, a demonstration of how nature could thrive when protected by competent oversight and modern conservation practices. The documents praised its stability, its resilience, and the remarkable absence of serious incidents. There were no large fires recorded in years, no confirmed cases of organized poaching, no significant conflicts between wildlife and visitors. The numbers were clean, the language confident. For administrators and donors alike, this sector was proof that the system worked. For the ranger assigned to it, the perfection felt heavier than the terrain itself. He knew the land not as a shaded polygon on a screen, but as a living body with moods and scars. His patrols took him through long hours of walking alone, following routes that shifted with the seasons. In spring, swollen streams forced him to detour across higher ground. In summer, the heat pressed down through the canopy, turning still air into something that clung to the skin. In autumn, fallen leaves disguised holes and slick stones, while winter stripped the forest bare and revealed distances that summer foliage concealed. He learned the sound of the place, the way birds fell silent before a storm, the subtle change in wind that meant smoke somewhere far off, the uneasy stillness that sometimes settled before dawn. His work followed a rhythm that had little to do with office schedules. He started before sunrise, checking equipment, syncing his GPS, reviewing notes from previous patrols. He inspected trailheads rarely used by tourists, examined old fire rings even when they showed no sign of recent use, and checked motion cameras placed along animal corridors. He logged tracks, scat, broken branches, anything that suggested movement or disturbance. Most days passed without incident, and that, according to the system, was exactly how things were supposed to be. Yet, the longer he worked this sector, the more the silence began to feel unnatural. In other parts of the park, even with heavier patrol coverage, problems emerged with stubborn regularity. Illegal campsites appeared overnight. Fires flared where they should not. Animals wandered too close to human activity, drawn by careless waste or emboldened by repeated encounters. Those areas generated reports, meetings, corrective plans. This sector did not. Here, trails remained clear even after storms that should have dropped branches across them. Springs flowed clean, their edges free of rot and debris that usually collected without maintenance. Signs of animal stress were rare, as if the wildlife had learned a careful balance with the land and the people who passed through it. At first, the ranger took pride in it. It was good to be responsible for a place that functioned so well. Supervisors spoke of the sector with approval, pointing to it during briefings as an example others should follow. Occasionally, select visitors were guided through parts of it, presented with carefully chosen views that reinforced the narrative of untouched wilderness under expert protection. The ranger did his job during those visits, ensuring safety and compliance, but he noticed that the real work seemed to happen elsewhere, beyond the scope of what anyone officially monitored. As weeks turned into months, small details began to stand out. A narrow animal trail that should have been choked with fallen limbs after a windy night remained passable, as though someone had cleared it just enough to keep it usable without making the work obvious. A shallow depression near a stream, once muddy and eroded, appeared stabilized, its edges reinforced with stones placed in a way that looked deliberate rather than random. These were not large interventions, not the kind that would draw attention or require documentation, but they accumulated in the ranger's mind like unanswered questions. He began to take more detailed notes, not for his reports, but for himself. He marked places that felt subtly altered, comparing them against his patrol schedule. More than once, he realized that changes had occurred during periods when no ranger, including himself, had been assigned to the area. The implication unsettled him. The park's rules were clear about unauthorized presence, especially long-term habitation. Any such discovery was supposed to be reported immediately. At the same time, nothing he observed matched the usual signs of trespassers or criminals. There were no scattered cans, no plastic, no aggressive traps, no felled trees taken for profit. Whatever was happening here left the forest healthier, quieter, and safer than it had any right to be. The ranger felt a growing tension between his training and his instincts. Professionally, he understood procedures, liability, and the importance of control. Personally, he felt responsible for the land itself, for the living systems that did not care about paperwork or jurisdiction. He had chosen this job because he believed in protection as something active and moral, not just administrative. Now he faced a contradiction he could not ignore. On one long patrol, as afternoon light slanted through the trees and the forest settled into its quieter phase, he paused near a bend in the river where the ground rose gently toward an older stand of hardwoods. The air smelled clean, touched with the faint sweetness of leaves beginning to decay. He realized then that the sector's perfection was not passive. It was maintained. The question was not whether something or someone was responsible, but who. That realization marked a shift. From that moment on, his patrols became searches, not for violations but for understanding. He still performed his duties, filed his reports, and followed protocol, but alongside that, he watched more closely. He looked for patterns instead of incidents, for signs of intention rather than damage. He began to accept that the order he was witnessing did not come solely from the system he served. By the time he noticed the old oak, split and darkened at its core, standing just far enough off the usual routes to be overlooked, he was already prepared to find something that would change the way he saw his sector forever. The oak stood where the ground dipped gently toward the river, far enough from the established patrol routes to escape casual notice, yet close enough to water that it should have shown signs of decay long ago. The ranger first noticed it because it did not fit. The surrounding trees bore the usual scars of age and weather, broken limbs, fungal blooms, scars left by lightning or insects. This oak, however, seemed deliberately spared. Its crown was full and green, its bark thick and deeply furrowed, but the center of its massive trunk was split open, darkened as if fire had once hollowed it from within. Despite that damage, it remained upright and strong, a contradiction that drew the eye even in a forest full of old giants. He approached cautiously, not out of fear, but habit. Years of patrolling had taught him that the most dangerous things in the wild were rarely obvious. As he circled the tree, he noticed that the ground around it was unusually clear. Fallen branches had been moved aside, not dragged far, just enough to create a subtle path that blended into the forest floor. Moss grew undisturbed along the edges, suggesting that whatever work had been done here was careful and infrequent, never enough to scar the land. Up close, the split in the trunk revealed itself as more than damage. The edges were smooth in places, shaped not by rot alone, but by human hands. The interior was blackened, not freshly burned, but marked by an old fire that had been controlled, contained, allowed to do its work without killing the tree. The ranger leaned in, listening. The hollow answered with a soft echo, deeper than he had expected. He hesitated. Protocol demanded inspection of any potential shelter or illegal structure, especially in a protected area. At the same time, instinct told him that whatever lay inside was not a threat in the conventional sense. Still, he unhooked his flashlight and stepped closer, pushing aside a loose curtain of bark and woven branches that had been arranged to resemble natural debris. The light cut into darkness and revealed a space that stopped him cold. Inside, the oak was not an empty cavity or an animal den. It was a room, not large by any ordinary standard, but impossibly complete given its setting. The interior walls followed the curve of the living tree, smoothed and reinforced where necessary, leaving the wood alive rather than stripped bare. The floor was dry, layered with packed earth and wooden slats laid carefully to keep moisture away. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke, herbs, and something mineral, like clean stone. As his eyes adjusted, details emerged one by one. A sleeping area occupied one side of the hollow, built from layers of branches, grasses, and old fabric, arranged with the care of someone who understood insulation and comfort. Nearby sat a small fire ring, no larger than necessary, its stones blackened but clean, ash swept aside as if regularly tended. Above it, a narrow channel rose through the tree, cleverly disguised to guide smoke upward without staining the opening or revealing itself from a distance. Along the curved walls, shelves had been carved or fitted into natural recesses. On them rested metal cups, a dented pot, simple utensils, all washed and stacked neatly. Bundles of dried plants hung from pegs, tied with twine made from natural fibers. Cloth-wrapped parcels suggested stored food, preserved carefully against insects and damp. Nothing was excessive. Nothing was wasted. The ranger stepped fully inside, his movements slow and deliberate. He was acutely aware that he was standing in someone else's home. The realization carried weight. This was not a temporary shelter thrown together in desperation, nor the hideout of someone trying to exploit the land. This place had been designed to last, to function quietly within the living body of the tree. He examined the fire pit more closely and found that it bore no signs of reckless use. The burns were shallow, controlled, the surrounding wood protected by stone and clay. Whoever lit fires here understood both the danger and the responsibility of doing so inside a living structure. The same discipline showed in the way tools were stored. A small axe rested in a groove near the entrance, its blade sharpened and clean. A knife lay wrapped in cloth. A coil of rope hung from a wooden peg, dry and neatly wound. The ranger noticed clothing folded carefully in a niche, thick layers for cold weather, lighter garments for warmer days, all patched and repaired multiple times. These were not the possessions of someone passing through. They were the tools of a life adapted to the forest, shaped by years of attention and restraint. As he moved deeper into the space, he became aware of something else. There was no sense of haste here. No sign that the occupant expected discovery or felt the need to flee quickly. The arrangement spoke of confidence and routine. This person lived here openly, at least by their own standards, trusting the forest and their own skill at remaining unseen. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of professional concern and reluctant admiration. He had encountered illegal camps before, but they were always marked by excess, by the carelessness of people who took what they needed and left the rest to rot. This place was the opposite. It was defined by absence, by what was not here. No trash, no unnecessary structures, no scars inflicted for comfort. He took photographs as required, documenting the space without disturbing it. Each image felt intrusive, as though he were violating a trust he had never been granted. He forced himself to continue, reminding himself that understanding required observation. In a corner near the back of the hollow, he found evidence that finally erased any doubt about the longevity of this dwelling. The floorboards there had been replaced more than once. Older layers were visible beneath newer ones, each repair careful, each improvement building on what came before. This was a place shaped by time. Standing in the center of the oak, the ranger realized that the quiet perfection of his sector had a heart. It beat here, inside this living tree, sustained by someone whose presence had gone unrecorded, whose work had been invisible to every system designed to measure success. The discovery did not answer his questions. It multiplied them. As he stepped back out into the forest, carefully restoring the makeshift covering at the entrance, he felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto his shoulders. He had crossed a threshold, not just into a hidden space, but into a truth that could no longer be ignored. The oak remained behind him, silent and watchful, holding its secret as it always had. Ahead lay the forest, unchanged in appearance, but transformed in meaning. The ranger did not return to the oak immediately after his discovery. He finished his patrol in widening arcs around the area, moving with a heightened awareness that changed the way he read the forest. Everything he saw now felt connected to the hidden space inside the tree, as though the oak had been a lens that brought a previously invisible pattern into focus. He moved more slowly, not because he feared being watched, but because he sensed that haste would make him miss the quiet logic behind what he was trying to understand. When he returned to the oak the following day, he did so with intention. He approached from a different direction, circling wide to ensure he was not followed, though the idea felt almost absurd in a place that seemed to reject intrusion altogether. Inside, the air held the same calm stillness as before. Nothing had been disturbed. The space remained exactly as he had left it, which in itself suggested routine rather than secrecy. Whoever lived here did not return constantly to check for signs of discovery. They trusted their invisibility. He began to study the objects within the hollow more carefully, no longer seeing them as a collection of items but as evidence of a coherent way of life. Each piece served a purpose, and no purpose overlapped unnecessarily with another. There was no redundancy, no accumulation for comfort or sentiment. The materials were chosen with an understanding of how they would age, how they would respond to moisture, cold, heat, and time. Fabric had been reinforced where friction would wear it down. Metal had been oiled lightly to resist rust without contaminating the environment. Wooden handles were smoothed by use, not ornament. what struck him most was what was missing. There were no modern plastics beyond what might have been salvaged and reused long ago. No bright colors, no reflective surfaces that could catch light and draw attention. Even the metal items had been dulled by years of careful handling. This was a life stripped of excess, but not of care. The care was simply directed differently, towards sustainability rather than accumulation. The clothing told its own story. The ranger lifted a folded jacket from its niche and felt its weight. It was heavier than it looked, layered and patched with a skill that suggested long familiarity with both needle and weather. Repairs were done not to hide damage but to reinforce it, strengthening weak points rather than disguising them. Different garments were stored according to season, ready to be rotated as conditions changed. This was not the wardrobe of a man waiting to be rescued or reintegrated into society. It was the wardrobe of someone who had chosen to remain. Tools occupied a central place in the hollow, arranged not for display but for immediate access. The axe was small but well balanced, suited for precise work rather than felling large trees. The saw showed signs of careful sharpening, its teeth evenly set. There were no power tools, no noisemakers, nothing that would draw attention or disrupt the forest's rhythms. The ranger recognized the philosophy behind these choices. They were the same principles he himself was taught, taken to their purest extreme. In a small recess near the back of the space, he found items that shifted his understanding more profoundly than anything else. Bundles of cloth, neatly wrapped and stored in a dry corner, contained bandages, strips of clean fabric, and simple splints carved from light wood. Nearby sat small containers holding dried leaves, roots, and resins, each labeled with faint markings scratched into wood. The smell confirmed what his training already suggested. These were medicinal plants, prepared and preserved for use. The implications were immediate and unsettling. This was not merely someone surviving quietly. This was someone tending. The ranger knelt to examine the supplies more closely and noticed stains that could not be mistaken for anything else. Old blood, cleaned carefully from cloth but never fully erased. Signs of repeated use, not once or twice, but over years. As he rose, his gaze caught on a low shelf where several small wooden forms rested. At first, he thought they were tools, but on closer inspection he saw that they were molds or braces, shaped to support limbs of different sizes. Not human limbs alone. Some were clearly designed for animals. The realization sent a chill through him, not of fear, but of awe. He began to look at the forest outside the oak with new eyes. The places where he had seen animals recover from injuries that should have slowed or killed them. The deer that limped for a season and then returned whole. The fox with the scarred flank that continued to hunt effectively. At the time, he had accepted these as fortunate outcomes. Now they took on a different meaning. Cleanliness permeated the space. Ashes were disposed of properly, carried away and scattered where they would not accumulate. Food remnants were buried deep or composted discreetly. The floor was swept, not obsessively, but regularly, enough to prevent pests without erasing the marks of daily life. This was order born of habit, not of fear. The ranger felt his initial sense of professional obligation begin to blur. Training told him to categorize what he saw as unauthorized habitation. Experience told him this was something else entirely. He had seen the aftermath of true violations of the park's rules, and they were always loud in their destruction, even when the perpetrators tried to hide. This place was quiet in a way that spoke of humility rather than concealment. He left the oak again, this time carrying nothing with him except a deeper unease. Over the following days, he widened his observations, linking the life inside the tree to the subtle order of the surrounding land. He found small feeding stations placed where injured or weakened animals could reach them without exposing themselves. He noticed water channels cleared just enough to prevent stagnation. He traced paths that curved gently around sensitive habitats, guiding foot traffic, human or animal, away from fragile ground. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. The person who lived inside the oak did not merely avoid harming the forest. He actively shaped conditions that allowed it to heal itself. He worked in increments so small that they blended into natural processes, correcting imbalances before they became visible problems. The ranger began to suspect that this hidden life extended beyond the oak, that the hollow tree was only a center, a place of rest and preparation. The true scope of the work lay scattered across the sector, woven into its daily rhythms. The thought unsettled him. It meant that the perfection attributed to official oversight had a different source entirely. At night, as he reviewed his notes, the ranger found it increasingly difficult to separate his duty from his conscience. He had sworn to uphold the rules that protected the park, yet he was confronted with a living example of protection more effective than anything those rules had produced. The life inside the oak challenged the very definition of legitimacy. He understood now that whoever lived there did not consider himself hidden. He was simply aligned with a scale of time and attention that made him invisible to systems built for efficiency and visibility. The ranger felt a reluctant respect grow within him, accompanied by a troubling question. If this unseen life were brought into the light, would it survive the attention, or would it be destroyed by it? The forest offered no answer. It continued to breathe, to grow, to balance itself, quietly benefiting from a care it never acknowledged. And somewhere within it, a man lived not apart from the land, but entirely within it, his existence written only in the health of the world around him. After the discovery inside the oak, and the quiet revelations it brought, the ranger could no longer move through his sector as he once had. The forest had become layered, its familiar surfaces now resting atop a hidden network of intention. Every step felt like an invitation to look closer, to question what he had previously accepted as coincidence or luck. He returned to his patrols with a different purpose, one that went beyond enforcement or observation. He was searching for continuity, for proof that the life inside the oak extended outward in deliberate, methodical ways. He began where instinct told him to start, not with the obvious roots, but with the margins. He walked the edges of his assigned territory, the places where boundaries blurred and oversight thinned. These were the areas where fires most often began, where poachers tested their luck, where the land bore the first signs of neglect. What he found there unsettled him. Small interventions appeared again and again, so subtle they would have been invisible to anyone not actively looking for them. A shallow trench cut along a slope, just enough to divert runoff and prevent erosion. Stones placed in a line that slowed the spread of water without stopping it entirely. Branches arranged to block an informal path that had begun to scar the ground, redirecting foot traffic along a more resilient route. He started marking these points on his map, not as violations but as questions. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. The interventions were not random. They clustered around areas of risk, appearing where the land was most vulnerable, then fading where natural balance had been restored. It was as if someone were constantly reading the terrain, anticipating its needs before damage could accumulate, As he followed these signs deeper into the forest, he began to notice the trails. They were not paths in the conventional sense. No earth had been worn down to bare soil, no clear lines cut through undergrowth. Instead, there were subtle corridors where vegetation bent rather than broke, where fallen leaves lay thinner, where the ground felt firmer underfoot. These routes avoided steep grades and sensitive habitats, curving naturally around obstacles. They were efficient without being aggressive, designed to move quickly while leaving as little trace as possible. Along these trails, the ranger found markings so discreet they bordered on the invisible. A slight notch in bark, old enough to have partially healed. A stone turned just enough to reveal a pale underside. A knot tied in a vine that would loosen and disappear with time. None of these signs meant anything to an outsider, but together they formed a language. The ranger understood it intuitively. It was a system of orientation and warning, meant for someone who returned again and again, who needed to remember without leaving scars. The deeper he went, the more he saw evidence of watchfulness. From certain rises in the land, the ranger found clear sight lines over common entry points, places where a person could stand unseen and observe movement below. These vantage points were not fortified or altered in obvious ways. They relied on natural cover, on the way branches overlapped or rocks rose just high enough to conceal a human form. The choice of these locations revealed an understanding of both human behavior and the rhythms of the forest. One afternoon, while inspecting a dry ravine that had once been flagged as a potential fire corridor, the ranger found signs that made his pulse quicken. The soil bore marks of recent disturbance, but not the chaotic churn of heavy equipment or careless digging. Instead, the earth had been scraped away in a narrow band, exposing mineral soil beneath. Nearby, the remains of dampened vegetation suggested that water had been carried here, poured deliberately along the exposed strip. It was a fire break, made by hand, small but effective. Without it, a spark carried by the wind could have raced through the ravine and into the heart of the sector. There was no record of this work, no report, no alert, no acknowledgement. The ranger stood there for a long time, imagining the moment when the fire had threatened this place. Someone had seen it early, recognized the danger, and acted without hesitation or recognition. The thought left him unsettled. The forest he had believed to be calm and self-sustaining was, in fact, constantly defended. As he continued his search, he encountered evidence of a different kind of intervention. In a clearing near the boundary, he found the remains of a trap, dismantled and buried with care. The metal jaws had been wedged open and rendered useless, then wrapped in cloth before being concealed beneath stones and soil. The placement suggested that whoever had found it understood both the cruelty of its purpose and the need to remove it quietly, without drawing attention or provoking retaliation. Nearby, faint signs of false trails led away from the site, guiding anyone searching for the trap deeper into rough terrain, where progress would be slow and frustrating. This was not the work of someone acting impulsively. It was strategic, patient, and informed by years of experience. The ranger felt a growing respect tempered by unease. Such actions, taken alone, might seem insignificant. Taken together, they represented a sustained campaign of protection carried out entirely outside the system he served. He began to understand the scale of what he was witnessing. The man inside the oak was not merely reacting to problems as they arose. He was anticipating them, shaping conditions so that threats never fully formed. Fires were stopped when they were still whispers. Poaching routes were disrupted before animals were harmed, Erosion was slowed before it became visible. The forest's apparent perfection was not a static achievement, but a dynamic process, maintained through constant, invisible labor. The ranger felt the weight of that realization settle heavily on him. It forced him to confront the limitations of his own role. No matter how dedicated he was, no matter how carefully he patrolled, he could not match the presence of someone who lived here full-time, who observed the land not in shifts but in seasons, not through reports but through lived experience. As dusk fell and the forest shifted into its evening rhythms, the ranger sat on a fallen log overlooking one of the hidden trails. The air cooled, carrying the scent of damp earth and leaves. Insects began their steady chorus, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. He imagined the unseen keeper moving through the same space, guided by signs the ranger was only beginning to recognize. The thought was both comforting and troubling. By the time he returned to his station that night, his understanding of the sector had changed irreversibly. The perfection celebrated in official documents was an illusion, a surface phenomenon masking a deeper truth. The forest was not protected by policies alone. It was guarded by a human presence that existed beyond recognition, beyond approval, beyond the reach of forms and signatures. The ranger knew then that he was no longer simply an observer of this hidden system. By seeing it, by understanding it, he had become part of it. The question that followed him into the darkness was not whether this invisible keeper existed. It was whether the truth of that existence could ever be reconciled with the world that refused to see him. The more the ranger followed the hidden traces woven through his sector, the harder it became to sit through routine briefings and file routine reports. Words that had once felt neutral now rang hollow in his ears. Phrases like stable conditions and effective oversight echoed differently after what he had seen with his own eyes. Each time he typed a summary of his patrol, he felt as though he were describing a surface reflection while ignoring the depth beneath it. The forest he walked through every day was real and breathing, shaped by effort and care. Yet the version of it that existed in official records was something else entirely. At night, he spread maps across his small desk and laid his notes beside them. Dates, locations, and observations formed a quiet indictment. He traced lines between the sites where he had found subtle interventions and compared them to his patrol schedule. Again and again, the evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Much of the work that kept the sector pristine occurred during gaps when no ranger was present. Fires suppressed before alerts could be triggered. Traps removed before animals were caught. Trails redirected before erosion reached reportable levels. None of it appeared in the system, because the system only recognized problems once they had become visible enough to document. He remembered meetings where supervisors praised the efficiency of their teams, citing this sector as proof that fewer resources were needed when management was done right. Funding decisions had been influenced by those assumptions. Patrol hours had been reduced, equipment reassigned elsewhere. The ranger now understood the irony. The very success attributed to the system had been achieved because someone else had quietly filled the gaps it created. As this understanding deepened, it began to weigh on him in ways he could not easily dismiss. He thought of the man inside the oak, of the careful balance he maintained, and of how fragile that balance would be if exposed. The rules were clear. Unauthorized habitation was a violation. Interference with wildlife management without approval was forbidden. Any ranger who became aware of such activity was obligated to report it. there was no room in the regulations for nuance or gratitude. The ranger imagined the sequence that would follow if he submitted a formal report. Investigators would arrive with equipment and authority. The oak would be examined, photographed, cataloged. The hidden dwelling would become evidence. The man who lived there would be detained, questioned, perhaps charged. His years of work would be reframed not as stewardship, but as trespass. The system would congratulate itself for enforcing the law, and the sector would lose the very presence that had kept it whole. What troubled the ranger most was how easily this outcome could be justified on paper. The reports would be accurate in their own way. They would list violations, cite codes, describe corrective actions. Nowhere would they account for the cost of losing an invisible protector. Nowhere would they record the gradual decline that would follow, the small fires that would grow larger, the traps that would go unnoticed, the delicate patterns of care that would unravel without anyone to replace them. He began to see the larger deception at work, not as a conspiracy, but as a structural flaw. The system rewarded visibility, not effectiveness. It documented outcomes, not processes. As long as the forest appeared healthy, the reasons did not matter. In that sense, the lie was not deliberate. It was built into the way success was measured. This realization placed the ranger in an impossible position. By remaining silent, he became complicit in the false narrative. By speaking up, he would destroy the life that made the narrative possible. The weight of that choice pressed on him during his patrols, turning familiar paths into corridors of doubt. Every sign of order he encountered felt like a question directed at him alone. He tested his thoughts against his own sense of duty. He had taken an oath to protect the park, to enforce its rules impartially. That oath did not include exceptions for good intentions. Yet the deeper truth of his work had always been about preservation, about ensuring that the land and its inhabitants could endure beyond human schedules and politics. The man in the oak embodied that purpose more completely than any regulation he knew. As days passed, the ranger found himself delaying decisions, not out of cowardice, but because he needed to understand the full scope of what was at stake. He revisited places where the hidden interventions were most evident, imagining what would happen if they stopped. The thought was not abstract. He could see it clearly. A ravine choked with brush would carry fire faster. A spring left uncleared would stagnate. Animals accustomed to subtle guidance would wander into danger. The sector's perfection would not collapse overnight, but it would erode, slowly and inexorably. He also considered the personal cost. If the truth emerged through someone else, if another ranger stumbled upon the oak or followed the same trails, his silence would be exposed. He would be accused of negligence, of concealing violations. His career would end, and his reputation would be stripped away just as surely as the old man's life would be dismantled. The system offered no safe path for honesty in this situation. In the quiet moments before sleep, the ranger confronted an uncomfortable question. Was the law meant to serve justice, or was justice sometimes found in resisting the law's blunt application? He had always believed the two aligned. Now he saw the gap between them widening with every step he took through the forest. The lie, once revealed to him, could not be unseen. It lived in every clean report, every congratulatory email, every presentation that praised the sector's success. The ranger understood that he stood at the edge of that lie, one decision away from reinforcing it or tearing it apart. Neither option promised peace. By the time he returned once more to the oak, standing beneath its broad canopy and listening to the muted sounds of life within the forest, He knew that the next step would require more than observation. It would require confrontation, not with authority, but with the human being who had become the silent axis around which this place turned. The encounter did not happen inside the oak. The ranger sensed, even before it occurred, that such a meeting would never take place in the heart of the hidden dwelling. That space was a sanctuary, not a threshold. Whoever lived there would not choose it as the place to be found. The meeting came instead on a morning when the forest was neither fully awake nor entirely asleep, when mist lingered low to the ground and the sounds of birds rose cautiously, as if testing the air. The ranger had followed one of the faint, nearly imperceptible trails he had come to recognize, moving slowly, deliberately, allowing the land to guide him rather than forcing his way through it. He was not hunting. He was waiting. The trail led toward a stretch of terrain that had long concerned him, an area where animals crossed near a natural funnel created by rock and water. It was the kind of place where danger gathered quietly, where a snare or a careless fire could do irreversible damage. He saw the man before the man saw him. The old figure stood at the edge of a clearing, bent slightly but steady, his movements economical and sure. He was working with his hands, adjusting something near the base of a tree, perhaps reinforcing a natural barrier or repairing a small diversion in the soil. There was no rush in his actions. He worked as if time belonged to him, as if the forest itself had granted him permission to be exactly where he was. The ranger stopped, instinctively easing his weight back to avoid making noise. For a long moment, he simply watched. The old man straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and surveyed the area with a practiced eye. His gaze moved over the clearing, along the slope, toward the distant line of trees, lingering on nothing, yet missing nothing. There was no weapon in his hands, no sign of alarm or defensiveness. He looked like someone who expected the world to be as it was, and trusted himself to respond when it changed. When the old man finally turned and noticed the ranger, there was no visible shock. His body did not tense. His hands did not rise in surrender or reach for anything. He merely acknowledged the presence with a stillness that spoke of acceptance rather than fear. The moment stretched, charged not with hostility but with consequence. The ranger took a step forward, careful to keep his posture open. He did not reach for his radio. He did not assert authority. In that instant, he made a choice that could not be undone, choosing observation over enforcement, understanding over procedure. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Up close, the old man bore the marks of a life lived outside conventional time. His skin was weathered and darkened by sun and wind, etched with fine lines that told of years spent reading the sky and the ground rather than clocks or calendars. His hands were strong, calloused, scarred in places by work rather than violence. His clothing was layered and worn, mended repeatedly, each repair a small testament to endurance rather than neglect. There was a calm in him that unsettled the ranger more than aggression ever could have. This was not the calm of resignation. It was the calm of someone who had long ago made peace with his choices and their consequences. His eyes, sharp despite his age, moved easily between the ranger and the surrounding forest, as if measuring not just a person, but the context he brought with him. The ranger felt the weight of everything he had discovered settle into this moment. The oak, the hidden trails, the fire breaks, the healed animals. All of it now had a human face, and that face did not resemble the caricatures of trespassers or criminals that policy manuals warned against. The old man's presence explained things that had puzzled the ranger for months. The consistency of care, the restraint, the patience. These were not the traits of someone hiding from the law out of fear alone. They were the traits of someone who had chosen a different kind of responsibility, one that did not require recognition to justify itself. As they stood there, the ranger became acutely aware of the imbalance between them. He wore a uniform that represented authority, law, and institutional power. The old man wore nothing that identified him, nothing that granted him protection beyond what the forest itself provided. And yet, it was clear who truly belonged to this place. The ranger did not need words to understand the man's situation. Everything about him spoke of separation from society. There were no signs of recent integration, no traces of a life that extended beyond the boundaries of the forest. This was not a temporary retreat. This was existence pared down to essentials, shaped by necessity and conviction. Later, as the ranger reflected on the encounter, he would piece together fragments of the old man's history through observation and inference. The way he moved suggested past labor, perhaps work that had once demanded physical endurance and discipline. The care with which he handled medicinal plants spoke of knowledge gained over time, maybe taught, maybe learned through trial and error. The absence of bitterness in his demeanor hinted at loss endured and accepted rather than resented. The ranger sensed that the old man lived without documents, without a legal name that the system would recognize. Such people existed on the margins, often by force rather than choice. He imagined a life disrupted by circumstances that left no room for return. Economic collapse, personal tragedy, institutional failure. Any of these could have driven a man beyond the reach of paperwork and back into the older logic of land and seasons. What mattered now was not how the old man had arrived here, but why he had stayed. The answer lay all around them. The forest bore his imprint, not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. He had learned its vulnerabilities and responded to them with care. He had taken responsibility for threats others did not see or chose to ignore. In doing so, he had bound his fate to the land's health. The ranger felt a profound shift in his understanding of stewardship. He had always believed his role was to protect the forest on behalf of the public. The old man protected it because it was his home. That distinction mattered more than any regulation. As they parted, without ceremony, the ranger knew that the encounter marked a turning point. The man returned to his work, unhurried, trusting that whatever decision the ranger would make, it would not be made lightly. The ranger walked away with a weight he had never carried before, the weight of knowledge that transformed obligation into choice. By the time he reached the edge of the clearing and paused to look back, the old man had already blended into the forest, his presence absorbed into the quiet order of the place. The ranger understood then that the forest did not merely tolerate the old man. It depended on him. And now, whether he wanted it or not, so did the ranger's conscience. The next step would not be about discovery or observation. It would be about consequence. After the meeting in the forest, the ranger found that silence followed him more closely than ever. It settled into his days and nights, threading itself through his thoughts with a persistence he could not escape. The image of the old man working calmly among the trees returned again and again, not as a memory, but as a question. It was no longer possible to think in abstract terms about regulations or procedures. Every rule now carried a human consequence, and every potential action unfolded in his mind as a chain of events he could no longer pretend not to see. He understood the legal reality with painful clarity. Unauthorized residence within a protected national park was a direct violation of federal regulations. Long-term habitation without permits, the use of fire, the manipulation of terrain, and the handling of wildlife, even with good intentions, could all be grounds for removal and prosecution. If the old man were discovered through official channels, the outcome would be swift and impersonal. An enforcement team would be dispatched. The dwelling inside the oak would be dismantled and documented. The man himself would be escorted out, questioned, evaluated, and passed along to systems ill-equipped to understand him. The ranger knew how those systems worked. He had seen them absorb people like machinery absorbs material, breaking them down into categories and cases. The old man would not be seen as a guardian or a caretaker. He would be labeled a squatter, a vagrant, a liability. His age would work against him. His lack of documentation would complicate everything. Medical evaluations would lead to institutional placement. Psychological assessments would strip context from his choices. Whatever autonomy he had preserved through years of self-reliance would vanish under fluorescent lights and locked doors. Equally clear was the second consequence, quieter but no less devastating. Without the old man, the sector would change. It would not happen immediately, and perhaps not dramatically enough to be traced to a single cause. The forest would continue to appear healthy for a time, sustained by momentum and residual balance. But the invisible interventions would stop. The early warnings would go unnoticed. Fires would grow larger before being seen. Traps would remain set longer. Small disruptions would accumulate until they demanded attention, and when that attention finally arrived, it would be too late to prevent damage. The ranger also understood what would happen on paper. Reports would cite natural causes, increased visitor pressure, climate variability. Budgets would be adjusted. More resources would be requested. No one would ever connect the decline to the removal of one old man whose name never appeared in a single document. The system would correct itself in the only way it knew how, by reacting rather than preventing. Then there was the matter of himself. The ranger's obligations were not theoretical. If he reported what he had found, he would be acting fully within the law. His superiors would commend him for diligence. His career would advance. If he remained silent, he would be violating protocol, risking disciplinary action, termination, and permanent damage to his record. Should the truth surface through another channel, he would be accused of concealment. His uniform, which had once represented pride and purpose, would become evidence against him. The pressure of that knowledge pressed inward, forcing him to confront a deeper question about why he had chosen this life in the first place. He had not joined the service for authority or advancement. He had joined because he believed in protection, in the idea that some places mattered enough to be defended even when doing so was inconvenient or invisible. Now, he was faced with the clearest test of that belief he had ever known. The old man had never asked for protection. He had not pleaded, bargained, or justified himself. His calm acceptance made the ranger's burden heavier, not lighter. The choice belonged entirely to the one who wore the badge. That imbalance of power haunted him. It meant that whatever happened next would not be the result of chance or discovery, but of deliberate decision. For days, the ranger walked the forest with that decision suspended inside him. He observed the land as though memorizing it, committing details to memory in case they were about to change forever. He watched animals move through corridors shaped by unseen guidance. He listened to water flowing cleanly through channels that would clog without care. Each sign of health felt like both affirmation and warning. He imagined alternative paths. One involved disclosure, followed by advocacy, an attempt to convince his superiors that the old man's presence was a net benefit. But he knew how unlikely that was. Institutions did not make exceptions for individuals who existed outside their control. Another path involved attempting to relocate the old man quietly, urging him to leave before discovery. But the ranger understood that this would only shift the problem, not solve it. The forest was not just where the old man lived, it was who he had become. To remove him was to erase his identity. There was also the most dangerous option of all, silence combined with responsibility. If he chose not to report, he would become a shield, standing between the old man and the system. That meant altering patrol reports, diverting attention, and managing risk quietly. It meant accepting that he alone would bear the consequences if anything went wrong. It meant becoming complicit, not in harm, but in protection that could never be acknowledged. The ranger did not romanticize this choice. He understood its cost. It would require constant vigilance, restraint, and self-control. It would blur the line between duty and defiance. It would isolate him from colleagues and force him to live with a secret that could not be shared. But as he weighed each possibility, one truth emerged with increasing clarity. Only one option preserved both the forest and the man who had devoted his life to it. The decision did not arrive in a dramatic moment. There was no single revelation, no sudden clarity. It formed slowly, like sediment settling in still water, until it became impossible to deny. The ranger accepted that he would protect the old man, not by elevating him into the light, but by allowing him to remain where he was. He would preserve the illusion that the system had created, not for the sake of appearances, but to safeguard the reality beneath it. With that acceptance came a new understanding of his role. He would no longer be just a ranger assigned to a sector. He would become a silent partner in an unseen alliance. He would learn to read the forest not only for threats, but for signs that the old man was active and safe. He would adjust his patrols to avoid drawing attention. He would ensure that no other eyes followed the same trails he had found. The choice did not feel heroic. It felt heavy, uncertain, and irrevocable. But it felt honest in a way that no report ever had. As the ranger stood one evening at the edge of the clearing where he had first seen the old man, watching the light fade through the trees, he understood that his life had shifted onto a narrower path. There would be no recognition for what he was about to do. No assurance that he had chosen correctly. Only the quiet knowledge that some responsibilities could not be delegated and some truths could not survive exposure. The forest, indifferent yet enduring, accepted his decision without comment. And somewhere within it, an old man continued his work, unaware that his fate now rested in the hands of someone who had chosen silence as a form of protection. The days that followed did not announce themselves with change. No alarms sounded, no unfamiliar vehicles appeared at the edges of the sector. The forest remained what it had always seemed to be to anyone who glanced at it briefly, calm, balanced, unremarkable in its health. Yet, for the ranger, everything had shifted. The decision he had made settled into his routines, altering them subtly but permanently, like a new current beneath the surface of familiar water. He adjusted his patrols with care. Routes were modified not to avoid responsibility, but to manage visibility. He walked where he needed to walk and stayed away from places that would draw attention if too many footprints appeared. Reports became exercises in precision, accurate without being exhaustive, truthful without being revealing. He described conditions as stable because they were. He logged no incidents because none had occurred. The words remained correct, even as their meaning deepened beyond what the system could detect. The ranger learned to read the forest for different signs now. Where once he searched for violations, he now looked for continuity. A cleared trail meant the old man had passed through recently. A repaired water channel meant vigilance had not lapsed. The absence of problems became a form of communication, a quiet reassurance that the invisible work continued. When days passed without such signs, the ranger felt a tightening in his chest, a fear he never voiced even to himself. He would slow down then, listen longer, observe more closely, until the forest answered him in its own way. His relationship with the land changed from stewardship to partnership. He no longer thought of himself as the sole protector of the sector, nor as its ultimate authority. He was one presence among two, each compensating for what the other could not do. He had access to information, to forecasts, to broader patterns beyond the boundaries of the forest. The old man had intimacy, constancy, and an understanding that came from living inside the rhythms of the place. Together, though never openly, they maintained a balance that neither could have achieved alone. At times, the ranger felt the strain of isolation. He could not speak of what he had seen or chosen. Conversations with colleagues remained professional, bounded by shared language that skimmed the surface of their work. When supervisors praised the continued success of the sector, he accepted the words without pride. He understood now how easily credit detached itself from cause. He understood how often true effort went unnamed. The forest itself bore witness to his choice more faithfully than any human institution could. Seasons turned, each bringing its own challenges and confirmations. In summer, lightning storms passed through the region, striking dry ground with dangerous frequency. Small fires flared and disappeared, leaving behind only faint scars that healed quickly. In autumn, heavy rains tested the stability of slopes and streams, yet erosion remained minimal, controlled before it could take hold. Winter came hard and cold, and still the wildlife endured, moving along paths shaped for survival rather than convenience. There were moments when the ranger glimpsed the old man at a distance, never close enough to intrude, never near enough to risk acknowledgement. A figure moving between trees at dawn, a silhouette bending near water at dusk. These sightings were brief and unremarkable, easily dismissed by anyone else. To the ranger, they were confirmations. The forest was not alone, neither was he. The weight of the secret did not lessen with time. If anything, it grew heavier as the implications of his choice stretched into the future. He knew that his career might end abruptly if the truth emerged. He knew that one mistake, one unexpected inspection, one curious visitor could unravel everything. He lived with that risk consciously, accepting it as part of the responsibility he had assumed. Fear became something he managed, not something he fled from. He also lived with a quieter understanding, one that reshaped his sense of justice. The law, he realized, was a tool, not a truth. It could protect or destroy depending on how blindly it was applied. In choosing silence, he had not rejected the law entirely. He had chosen to interpret its purpose rather than its letter, to serve the life it was meant to preserve rather than the structure that enforced it. The old man remained invisible to the world beyond the trees. His work continued without acknowledgement, his existence recorded only in the health of the land. The ranger understood that this invisibility was both protection and sacrifice. Recognition would have brought validation, but it would also have brought scrutiny, control, and eventual displacement. By remaining unseen, the old man preserved not only the forest, but himself. There were nights when the ranger lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant calls of animals, and wondered whether his choice would hold. He imagined futures in which the sector changed hands, in which new leadership demanded audits and inspections, in which systems tightened their grip. He did not know how long the fragile equilibrium he had chosen to defend would last. He only knew that, for now, it existed. In time, the ranger came to see that his decision had altered him as profoundly as it had altered his work. He was more patient, more cautious in his judgments, less willing to accept appearances as truth. He noticed how often society relied on unseen labor, on people who held things together without reward or recognition. The forest had taught him that lesson, quietly and without ceremony. The sector remained a model of success in official documents. It continued to be cited in meetings and presentations, its stability praised as evidence of effective management. The ranger no longer resented this misattribution. He understood it as part of the necessary illusion that kept the deeper reality intact. The lie, once revealed to him, had become a shield rather than a deception. On a clear morning, months after his decision, the ranger paused near the old oak, standing at a respectful distance. He did not enter. He did not look for signs. He simply stood, letting the presence of the tree and the life it sheltered exist without intrusion. The oak rose above him, its split trunk dark and unassuming, its crown alive and strong. The ranger turned away and continued his patrol, footsteps blending into the forest floor. Behind him, the oak remained, holding its quiet secret. Around him, the land breathed steadily, sustained by care that would never appear in any report. In the end, there was no final reckoning, no moment of resolution that closed the story neatly. There was only continuation. The forest endured. The old man worked. The ranger watched and protected without being seen, and in that enduring silence, the truest form of guardianship remained exactly where it belonged, invisible, uncompromised, and alive. If this story made you think, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, watch other videos on the channel right now, and share this video with someone who loves powerful, meaningful stories.